Hello, welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast, hosted by me, Jack Perks. Professionally, I'm a wildlife cameraman, but I dabble in podcasting, and each Tuesday we release an episode as I have a chat with scientists, artists, filmmakers, and passionate people all about nature in a light-hearted and certainly not serious way. Hello and welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast. I'm your host, Jack Perks. So today we're talking about Atlantic salmon, and I'm doing this one solo. I was meant to have a guest join me, but it didn't quite work out. So instead, while I was in the Cairngorm National Park last November, I decided to record this on the banks of the River Spey. It's a lovely snowy environment. I'm absolutely freezing my tits off during this one, but it was still enjoyable even though I was on my own. As always, at the beginning of each podcast, I plug buymeacoffee.com. So many of you will know that this podcast is completely independent and that the only way that I get any support is via you, the listener. You can choose to donate at the price of a coffee or a pound, around about £5. You can donate more if you want, and that really helps me going. If you do that, you can also leave a message. I'm going to read out a couple of the things that people have put when they've donated. So Robin Bradley, he bought me a coffee and he put Love the Bass podcast. That was a recent one a few weeks ago. Dan Knight bought me 3 coffees and he put always appreciate the podcast and the YouTube videos. Thanks for that, Dan. And then Jesper Wandam put listening from Denmark and watching videos. It's all great. Sincerely, Jesper. So yeah, fantastic. It's always great to have people kind of get involved. And yeah, if you can support the podcast, absolutely brilliant. If you can't support financially, don't worry. The podcast is free. Those people are paying for you to listen to it. And you can share the podcast, you can tell your friends about it, you can write a review, you can listen to previous episodes. There's well over 150 episodes now, so if you've not listened to all of them, go back and listen to them and help our numbers. It really helps us out. Now, if you're listening to this podcast when it first comes out on the 25th of February 2025, then tomorrow, the 26th of February, is our first live podcast in Nottingham. There is still time to get tickets if you want to. The tickets are completely free. We're not charging for the event, and it's going to be myself and Ross Burney. I'm going to be interviewing Ross. He's an amazing wildlife cameraman, done some incredible stuff, and I'm also joined by fellow podcasters How Many Geese, Jack Adams and Roddy Shaw. It's going to be a great evening. We've sold most of the tickets, but I think there are, I say sold, it's free, but we've given away most of the tickets. It should be a great event. It's at Nottingham Trent University, the Brackenhurst campus. I'm really excited. That episode will be out on the podcast in a couple of weeks, so you'll be able to listen to the live podcast even if you couldn't make the live event. I am also potentially doing a live podcast at Bird Fair, so I was just speaking to the people at Bird Fair, and I'm actually thinking about having a stall at there, which is the first time I've ever done anything like that. It's going to be a little bit different. For those of you that don't know, Bird Fair is basically like a huge event that happens in Rutland every year, and it's to do with bird watching, bird holidays. You get all these kind of people from all walks of the wildlife spectrum. But I've always felt that fish are pretty much non-existent at it, so I'm going to be changing that. So on my stall, it's going to be something slightly different. I will be selling, little bits and bobs, but I'm also planning to have some fish tanks set up and actually show the public some different aquatic species, which I'm very excited about. And as well as that, I'll also be hosting the odd podcast or two, so that should be great. A couple other events. Don't worry, we'll get to the salmon eventually. I'm going to be at the photography show on the 10th of March. So if you're in London on the 10th of March, the photography show is at the Excel Arena. I think that's what it's called. I've got 2 talks that day, which you can come along and see, or I'll be kind of mooching around there. So you want to talk about cameras, photography, anything like that, I'll be there on the 10th of March. I've also got some screenings for Britain's Hidden Fishes coming up. So some of you will know that I did a film with Jeremy Wade. It's just over an hour long, and it was essentially Blue Planet but British fish is how I'm kind of selling it. Jeremy narrated it, I did some of the filming. Ross, who actually I'm interviewing tomorrow, he also did some of the filming on it. So we've got a few screenings coming up. On the 5th of March, you can come and see Britain's Hidden Fishes at Devon, and that's at the Arundel Hotel. So it's a fantastic hotel. It's a bit posh, but nothing wrong with that. And yeah, you can come and see the film there. I'm really excited for that on the 5th of March. On the 6th of March, the following day, I'll be in Cornwall at the Seeners Arms in Perranporth, and there'll be a Q&A after that as well. I'll be at both of these events, I should say. So if you live in Devon or Cornwall and you fancy coming along to those, I'd love to have you. I think there are tickets for both of those, although I know they have sold fairly well. And then lastly, There's also, on the 1st of May, a little bit later on, at Shroud Brewery, I'm doing a screening of Britain's Hidden Fishes. So you get to see the film, you get to have a Q&A with me, and I dare say there'll be a beer or two because it's at a brewery. So I'm very, very excited for that one. And I think there are some tickets for that as well. So I'll chuck links for those in the description. Currently, because I keep getting people asking me what's happening with Britain's Hidden Fishes, the only way that I can publicly show this film is via screenings at the minute. Until we get it on television, which I'm really trying hard to do, but television is somewhat on its arse at the moment. So the only way that I can show people the film is via screenings. Eventually, if all else fails, it will go on YouTube. Eventually, but I'm talking this is going to be a couple of years. Essentially, I'm with a distributor and I've signed a 5-year contract, of which we've already done 2 years. So worst case scenario, in 3 years, it'll go on YouTube. But if you would like to see the film before that, then the screenings are your best bet. Right, we've got all that out of the way. Let's get on to today's episode. I'm in the Cairngorms.
Hello.
It's snowy, it's cold,
to the Bearded
and I'm
Tits
going to talk
podcast.
about salmon.
Today, I'm in the Cairngorms National Park. It's November, and I'm surrounded by snow in Anagak Woods near Granton-on-Spey. It is like something out of Narnia. It's absolutely beautiful. Have a listen to this. That is, what is it, BDS? No, not BDSM, that's something else. ASMR? That the thing where you listen to a sound and you like it. It is absolutely caked in snow, which ordinarily I would absolutely love, and I'd be chuffed to death being in a snowy environment. However, I own a Toyota Yaris, and that doesn't like snow. And I actually got stranded on the way up here. I had to get diverted off the A9 and then went through the back of the Cairngorms, through Glen Shee. I knew things were getting bad when I started seeing snowdrifts, and I actually had a mountain hare run in front of my car, which I was like, this ain't fucking good if I've got Arctic animals running in front of me. Eventually I got to a town called Ballater, which is, I think I'm saying that right, which is just past Balmoral, and in fact the weather was so bad I didn't even see Balmoral Castle. And I had to get a hotel for the night there, and then the following day I just about got to Granton-on-Spey. So I think this is called Storm Bert or something like that, or whatever it is. It's very snowy anyway, is the point that I'm trying to get. So because of this snow, I've not been able to do what I normally do here in the Cairngorms, which is pretty much every November I come up here and I try and film salmon spawning. And I've been doing this for about 7 or 8 years now. This is the first year that weather's beaten me. I've been here for 3 days. The snow isn't showing any signs of leaving. We've not had any more snow, but the temperatures aren't getting warm enough for it to melt. So I've not been able to go out and film. So I'm sort of stuck in limbo. It's a bit like COVID again. I just wake up in the hotel, eat some breakfast, go for a walk, have a cup of tea, go for another walk, do some work. It's been really, really peculiar and frustrating because I've travelled a long way to come up here and film salmon, and it's looking like I'm not going to be able to do it. Now, I know some of you will be thinking, oh, for God's sake, it's just a bit of snow, crack on. The main roads are fine, don't get me wrong. Here in the Cairngorms, they're very, very good at, dealing with the snow and the cold weather. So all the main roads are clear, but it's the side roads that are difficult, and that's where I need to go on these side roads to film the salmon. And what I really don't want to happen is to park down one of these side roads, be in a river all day, and freeze my arse off and then not be able to get out. That would be hell. So I just think, you know what, I'd rather play it safe, and I'm just going to catch up on some other things, which has led me to doing this podcast about salmon. We got there in the end, don't worry guys. Now originally I was going to have someone from the Spey Fishery Board come on and interview them. However, 2 things. 1, I can't get anywhere to them, and 2, they're busy with their hatchery. It's a little bit of a contentious subject among people who like salmon, but they've got a hatchery on the Spey. So you're going to have to make do with me. So in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about Atlantic salmon. Now, before I do that, I would just like to point you in the direction of buymeacoffee.com. If you can help me out, this podcast is completely independent. I'm not sponsored. No one pays me to do it. I do it off my own back and my own time. It's you, the listener. If you can afford to do so, it's greatly appreciated. It's the price of a pint or a coffee, about a £5, and there's no subscription. You just pay when you want to. If you can do that, it massively helps me. It helps pay for the cost of hosting the podcast and also for my time in doing it. So if you can consider doing that, there's a link in the description. and you can pay me for the work that I'm doing. If you can't pay me, don't worry about it. It's a free podcast. Anyone can listen to it. But if you can, it's greatly appreciated. So let's get on to Atlantic salmon. I'm going to have a walk down to the Spey because here at Granton-on-Spey, the clue's in the name, I suppose, the river is right at the bottom. Sorry, I had Eggs Benedict this morning. It's repeating on me. You didn't need to know that. I'm going to walk down and see the river, but I'm just going to have a walk through the woods first. And if we see any wildlife along the way, I'll mention that I'm currently stood by some bird feeders, and I'm hoping for a crested tit would be lovely. Did see some red squirrels earlier. Anyway, I'm not going to say Atlantic salmon here. Atlantic salmon, Samo solar, they are known as the leaper in Latin. And obviously, salmon are one of those fish that transcend popular culture. Everyone knows what a salmon is. There's no one who doesn't know what a salmon is. Whereas I could go up to someone and say, do you know what a gudgeon is? And I feel like very few people will actually know what a gudgeon is, or a tench, or even a perch. But salmon, everyone knows what a salmon is. And whether it's because of you eating them, or whether it's because you've seen them on a documentary. The other thing as well, if I would wager, if you spoke to anyone and said, tell me a fact about salmon, they would immediately say they jump, they migrate, and they die after spawning. So not only does everyone know about salmon, everyone also knows a little bit about the life history of that fish, which is incredible. There aren't many animals. Like, for example, if I said, do you know what a robin is? And go, yeah, of course I know what a robin is. Do you know something about its natural history? I don't think many people would be able to tell you a fact about a robin. But they do about salmon. So they are incredible fish in that regards. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through some facts, some figures, and some interesting stuff about Atlantic salmon. So Atlantic salmon are the only native salmon to Europe. There are pink salmon here now, which are Pacific salmon, and they were introduced by accident via Russian fish farms. And they are slowly spreading around into British waters. In fact, here in Scotland, on the River Ness, has had them confirmed to be breeding. But they've turned up in all kinds of rivers. They don't seem to be in huge numbers here yet. However, if you go over to Norway, they are in plague proportions in some rivers. And the concern is that these pink salmon might be competing for food with Atlantic salmon at sea. They're actually not that much of a problem in the river. They spawn in August, so they're not competing for the same spawning habitat. They're much smaller than Atlantic salmon, and they can't hybridize. So in river, they're not really an issue. But out at sea, they will be competing for the same food, and that's where we're slightly worried about these invading pink salmon. So it's something to keep an eye out for. If you hear a report of someone catching a funky-looking salmon on a river in the UK, it may very well be a pink salmon. Atlantic salmon can get big. The British record is 64 pounds, caught by Georgina Ballantyne. I want to say in the 1920s, I can't remember. I want to say 1926, but I don't know if that's correct. And she caught that on the Tay, I think. Again, I'm doing this all off memory because I'm freezing my arse off in a Scottish woodland. But yeah, it's one of the few British records that's held by a woman. And it's held for a very long time. And to be honest, with the state of salmon, I can't see it changing anytime soon. So it's an amazing fish. And of course, in those days, salmon fishing was all about for the pot. You would catch a salmon, you'd bring it home, you'd eat it. Whereas it's all catch and release in the British Isles now. You're not allowed to take salmon. And I think generally the sport has kind of come to the conclusion that there's no point in taking salmon anyway. So no one would ever catch a salmon and take it home currently. If numbers were to kind of get better, who knows, that might change. But certainly for the foreseeable future, all salmon fishing is catch and release. So what about spawning salmon? You think you know the story. So if we go by sort of like the textbook way, it's salmon migrate upriver, lay their eggs, the eggs develop in the river, they go out to sea, feed up, come back to the same river. That's more or less correct, but I'm just going to kind of fill in some of the blanks. So salmon generally go back to the same river they were born in, but not always. And they don't go necessarily back to the exact same spot they were born in. But generally they do have a preference to go to their natal river. But you will get some salmon that are called wanderers. And these are the explorers of the salmon world. So they'll actively try and colonise new rivers. Which means salmon have the unique ability that if you do lose salmon from a river, they can recolonise on their own eventually, providing the water quality and the habitat is sufficient. We're also finding that if new waterways open up, they'll colonise them. For example, in Iceland, where the ice is rapidly melting, glaciers are melting, it's creating brand new rivers rivers that were never there before. And what they're finding is within a matter of a couple of years, sea trout and salmon are colonising these brand new rivers. Because we know these rivers have never been there before, we know that these salmon weren't born there, so they're colonisers. So they're incredible fish in that regards. Now, a female salmon is known as a hen, and a male salmon is known as a cock. That shouldn't make me laugh. So juvenile. And the male salmon are quite different looking to the female. They've got what's called a kype, and this is a big hooked jaw. The reason they have this big hooked jaw is that they'll use that for fighting. So they've got rows of sharp teeth, and they'll fight other male salmon so that they can spawn with a female, which is absolutely incredible. They've got these amazing colours. When salmon are out at sea, they are bright silver. They're gorgeous. They're really like platinum. Absolutely phenomenal. But as they enter freshwater, obviously they'd stand out like a sore thumb. So that's a coal tit above me then, making a racket. So when they get the river, they start to go more brown, red, and get all these tartan colours on them. So the fact that salmon can go from fresh to salt water and vice versa means they're androgynous fish. Well, fresh to salt is androgynous, salt to fresh is catadromynous, I think. But anyway, salmon can do both, so they're incredible fish in that regards. So they're in these beautiful colorations. Not all salmon die after spawning, not all Atlantic salmon anyway. So again, like the kind of fact that everyone knows, oh, salmon die after spawning. But Atlantic salmon buck the trend a little bit. It's thought that around 5%, mostly females, are return spawners. So whenever you see these really, really big salmon, they've probably spawned multiple times. A lot of them do die. It takes a lot out of them. They're not eating while they're in the river. They're expending lots of energy, travelling to their spawning spots and obviously spawning. So a lot of them do die or succumb to predation or whatever. But some do go back out to sea and they will repeat spawn. Now, when they go to sea, they go as far as Greenland. That's 1,000 miles from the British Isles, so they go a fair way. The reason they go all the way to Greenland is it's rich pickings. There's lots of sardines, capelin, shrimps, and they get fat on this kind of rich protein diet. So that's why they go out to sea, because there's more food for them to eat. A female salmon can have around 800 eggs per pound in body weight, so they can produce a lot of offspring given the opportunity. Now, when they're doing this, they create something called a redd, which is a nest for fish. So the female salmon will come along and she'll find a nice patch of clean gravel. That's salmon heaven. And she'll use her tail to create a depression in the gravel, where she'll lay her eggs. Once she's done that, the male will come in and he'll rub up against her. He'll slide into her DMs, if you like, and he'll vibrate slowly. This encourages her to release the eggs. He releases the sperm or the milt, and they fertilise the eggs. She'll then kick her tail over to cover those eggs, and they'll stay in the gravel for weeks and weeks before they hatch out into little alvins. They could spend anywhere up to 3 years in the river before they go out to sea. Generally speaking, less food there is, the longer they spend in the river. So salmon in Scotland, for example, are more likely to be in the river for 2 or 3 years, sometimes even 4 years. But salmon in southern England, where there's more food in the river, they might only be in there for a year. They're in, they're out, they do it. What's interesting as well is that salmon in chalk streams, particularly the Test and the Itchen, these rivers in Dorset and Hampshire, have been found to be genetically distinct from the rest of salmon in the UK. And in fact, it's believed that they are a subspecies. This was by the Journal of Fish Biology that did a study on them in 2022. So there could actually be an argument for a separate subspecies of salmon in the UK. The worry is, though, that salmon in southern England are at the extreme end of their temperature tolerance. 22 degrees is about as warm as a salmon can take, and that's more or less what the rivers are getting to in the summer. So there is a very realistic possibility that we're going to lose salmon from southern England in the next 4 or 5 years, which is a crazy thought. And to be honest, the outlook for salmon in the rest of the UK is not looking much better. Salmon numbers are plummeting. And to think this is an iconic fish that would have been in pretty much every river in the British Isles is now facing extinction in the UK is mind-boggling to me. But why is it getting to this situation? Well, there's a cocktail of problems. Suitable habitat is one of the main things. So I mentioned before that salmon like to spawn on gravel. They need clean, fast-flowing water with clean gravel with no silt on it. If you end up with rivers that get silted up or algae on the gravel, it's much harder for those eggs to come through, and often they get choked of oxygen. So habitat is absolutely key. Barriers to migration. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, you know that I absolutely can't stand weirs and sluices, and I think they should all be blown up with a stick of dynamite. The problem with these barriers is they stop fish moving up freely. They hold the fish back. And even if they don't stop the fish completely, they waste valuable energy that the fish could otherwise be putting into spawning and conserving it. So barriers either completely stop them getting to good spawning habitat, or they use up more and more energy. We need to get rid of the weirs, or at the very least, we need a free flow fish pass on everywhere in the UK. And the trouble is, we have got thousands of weirs in the UK. It is a major, major problem that needs addressing. The biggest mystery, however, though, is what's happening when these salmon go out to sea. Because we're finding that good numbers, a high percentage are leaving from the rivers, but very, very few are returning. And the honest answer is we don't really know what's happening out there. Whether it is predation, whether it's disease, whether it's not being able to find the right amount of food, whether it's they're not reaching their spawning grounds, whether it's overfishing. We simply don't know what's happening to salmon when they go out to sea. But what we do know is that is a major issue. Something's happening out there and it's stopping salmon coming back. It's probably a good point for me to mention about salmon farming briefly. We have covered this on the podcast before, so if you want to kind of go back and listen about salmon farms, I would encourage you to never eat farmed salmon. It is a vile industry, and if you saw some of the pictures of these farmed salmon, there's flesh falling off them, they're riddled with parasites and disease. It's absolutely foul. The problem with salmon farms, or one of them, is that they are breeding grounds for fish lice. When these small smolts go out to sea, they pass these fish farms and they get bombarded with fish lice, and the mortality rate is incredibly high. The only thing we can do is boycott it. Don't eat it. There's plenty of other fish you can eat. Farmed salmon is horrendous. I mean, if you're not sure about the issues, you can look into it more online, or I say, go back and listen to the previous podcasts that we did. But yeah, definitely don't eat farmed salmon. It is not a good thing to go for. I mentioned that Atlantic salmon are called the leaper. They can jump up to 3 meters in the air, which is bonkers. So they're pretty good at navigating natural barriers. But sometimes some of these weirs are just too much for them. They just can't do it. We also have sea trout in the UK. And sometimes people get a little bit confused as to how to tell the difference between a sea trout and a salmon. So a sea trout is just a brown trout that goes to sea. It's not a kind of salmon. They don't typically go as far as salmon either. They tend to hang around more the estuaries. But how do you tell the difference between a sea trout and a salmon? So the differences between a sea trout and a salmon. So generally speaking, the corner of the mouth on a sea trout extends beyond the eye. There's like a bony plate, and that will go beyond the eye on a sea trout. But with a salmon, it's roughly in line with the eye. Salmon are generally more streamlined. Sea trout tend to be pretty bulky. The head on a salmon is pretty pointed, and on a sea trout it's more rounded. It's like a bulldog almost. Oh, I can see a red squirrel above me. Hello, mate. He's coming to have a look. Salmon have relatively few spots, whereas sea trout can be heavily spotted, and you typically find that the spots don't extend below the lateral line on a salmon, but not always. With salmon, the tail is forked, whereas sea trout, it's more square. And if you're an angler, you can pick up a salmon by the wrist of its tail. You'd struggle to do that with a sea trout. So that can be difficult to tell, I suppose, but once you know what you're looking at, they're relatively easy to tell apart. The trick, however, is that they can hybridize. So you do get hybrids, and they're very difficult to tell apart. So sea trout and Atlantic salmon can hybridize. They are very, very tricky to tell apart. I've never actually seen like a confirmed photo of a sea trout salmon hybrid, but they do exist. We know they can do it. I've actually filmed them having a go at it, so it's definitely possible, and they're closely related enough that it could happen. I know that you get Atlantic salmon all across Europe, and in fact you also get them on the east coast of America. Everyone thinks, when you think of America, you think of Pacific salmon, the 5 species that you get over there. But on the east coast of America, particularly around Maine, you do get Atlantic salmon as well. And I remember I posted something about sea trout and Atlantic salmon spawning, and I got this barrage of abuse from a load of Americans, and I just couldn't work out why. And I think the reason is they have a fish in America on the east coast called a sea trout, or what they call a sea trout. But it's a marine fish. It's not related to trout or salmon at all. And they just couldn't get it in their heads that another country called something different. And I gave up on the end. There's only so much you can do to help the intelligence challenged people out there. But yeah, it was a pretty widespread fish. You do get Atlantic salmon pretty much all throughout most of Europe. Okay, do you want a little bit more snow ASMR or whatever it is? Hang on. I don't know if you really heard that. You can probably hear the river though. So this is the Spey, the glorious River Spey. Again, I'm kind of realising that podcasting is not a great way when... Oh, what was that? Oh, it was a duck. When I'm seeing something beautiful, all you're hearing is my East Midlands nasally voice and some trickle of water. You're not getting the full totality of this. So the sun is just peeking over the horizon. It's this glorious, very calm orange that's twinkling over the river. There's snow-capped stones all throughout the Spey. The water is remarkably clear. The Spey can be quite clear. I don't normally film in the Spey itself. It's the tribs I generally go for. But, you know, in the right conditions, you could get to it. As far as I'm aware, this part of the Spey, you don't get salmon spawning. So there's not much point in me getting the cameras out here. But it is absolutely glorious. I can just see some beds of ranunculus, which I was actually chatting to someone the other day. Ranunculus isn't native to the Spey catchment. And in fact, they're having problems with it because it's making the substrate firmer, and that's impacting pearl mussels, which are an amazing animal in themselves, which maybe I'll do a podcast on pearl mussels at some point. But the short story is pearl mussels need very, very clean water. They can live up to 130 years old, and they need salmon to reproduce because they reproduce, the larvae grows inside of a salmon's gill, so they're intrinsically linked. Maybe I will do a podcast on them because I do would be an interesting one to tell. I can't see any salmon at the minute, but I would be shocked if there weren't some moving around here somewhere. The Spey is a lovely river. There's even a cast in fly fishing called the Spey cast, and essentially it's designed so that you stay in the river and you don't catch onto trees on the bank. I think it's the gist of it. I've never actually done it myself. I'm not much of a salmon angler. I've only ever fished for salmon once, and that was a few weeks ago, and inevitably I blanked. This is beautiful though, absolutely beautiful. It's fucking freezing. One of my testicles has fallen off. I can't feel my feet. My face is redder than an alcoholic in a brewery. I am cold as hell, but I'm bringing you this podcast from the Cairngorms. The last thing I wanted to talk about before I leave you to it about salmon, I feel like I've covered a good depth on them, is something called a precocious par. So precocious par are basically immature male salmon that will spawn before they go out to sea. And this is how they do it. So you've got a female salmon, a hen salmon that we all know now. And she's on the red, she's given her come over eye, she's got a lipstick on, little mini skirt, she's looking tarty as hell, she wants it. So the big male salmon, the cock salmon, he's trying to give her one. But these little tiny salmon, these precocious par that haven't even gone to sea yet, there's no way they can fight a big male salmon. He's going to chomp them and kill them. It's one of the reasons actually why salmon fishing is a thing, because in theory salmon don't feed in fresh water, but they're very aggressive because they want to chase off small par that, one, might be able to try to spawn with their girl, and two, might be trying to eat their eggs. So the whole thing about salmon fishing is basically built on pissed off fish. You're trying to piss the fish off until it takes the bait. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent there. So you've got the salmon there. What happens is when she goes to lay her eggs and the big male salmon goes to fertilise them, these precocious par, these little par, sneak in when no one's looking and essentially jizz all over the eggs. That's the technical term. and they get their genes spread before they go out to sea. And it's basically an insurance policy, and it means that if those salmon don't make it back in 3 years' time, they have spread their genes on. So it's an amazing strategy of essentially just hiding, running in, and jizzing. Nature's wonderful, isn't it? I thought I'd leave you with that one. Oh, there's one more thing, actually, that I did think about. It's about landlocked salmon. We don't get landlocked salmon in the UK, because a lot of people are like, why do salmon go to sea? Can't they stay in fresh water the whole time? Technically they can, but their instincts are so strong, they'll always try and go to sea. If you go to continental Europe and in America, you do get some landlocked salmon in the same way that you get, say, Arctic char in the UK, but they don't get anywhere near as big as the salmon that go to sea. And in fact, there was a population, I'm just remembering, there was a population of landlocked salmon, but it was artificial, and it was, I want to say it was in Rutland, and it was basically in a fishery, and they created an artificial river that went into a lake, and they did have these salmon that would run out of the lake, spawn in the river, and go back. And I think that was the only landlocked population of Atlantic salmon in the British Isles. Then the fishery closed a few years ago, so they're not around anymore. So we did technically have some. The last point I will make before I go is that Atlantic salmon are this iconic fish. They're an amazing fish. If you can go and see them leap, you definitely should. Wow. Hundreds of fieldfare and redwing are just flying over my head. That is incredible. These will have come from Siberia. Oh, incredible. Anyway, I'm not meant to be talking about birds, I'm meant to be talking about fish. They are this iconic fish. You can see them leaping in places like Bucanty Spout, Falls of Shin. I mean, anywhere, basically, you've got half a chance of seeing salmon leap. You should definitely go see it if you can. November's probably a bit late. Kind of end of September, October, after a bit of rain, that's when you want to go out. And they've got so many conservation charities dedicated to them. I think last time I checked, there's something like 8 NGOs, non-government organisations, that are either directly dedicated to salmon or strongly involved with salmon. And if I'm going to be an old cynic here, I'd say, do we need 7 different organisations all dedicated to one fish, when maybe it would be a better idea to join them all up and just have, rather than 7 whispers, one loud voice that will be heard? It's my humble opinion anyway. I think the other reason for that is, if you look historically, salmon are something that are expensive. Wealthy people would have eaten them. Wealthy people would have fished for them as well. It's not cheap to go salmon fishing normally. So when salmon start to decline, those people with power, money and influence are the ones that are going to be shouting about it. Whereas if we look at, say, another rare fish like the Vendace, which I bet a lot of you have never even heard of a Vendace. It's a glacial relic that's found in a couple of lakes in the Lake District and a couple of lakes in Scotland. It's probably going to go extinct in the next decade because fuck all is being done about them. And it's one of the reasons why I like to try and promote the lesser known fish, because salmon, as much as I love them, they've got enough people shouting about them. But there are other fish that do need a voice, and I think it's a shame that they don't get it. I mean, an interesting fact, there's no NGO for freshwater fish in the UK, which I find mind-boggling. There's an NGO for, when I say NGO, I mean a charity, for moths. There's an NGO for spiders, for fungus, for plants, but there is no NGO that is specifically looking at freshwater fish as a whole. You've got groups like the Angling Trust that kind of, they cover fish because of angling, or you've got groups that do specific fish, like the Wild Trout Trust, which are very good, but there isn't one that does freshwater fish as a whole, which I think is crazy, and something needs to be done about that for sure. Anyway, I'm going to go get a cup of tea, maybe even a whiskey. I wouldn't mind a little. It's probably a little bit early for that, but, I haven't got anything else to do. There's plenty of distilleries up here, so I could definitely find one. And I'm going to leave you to it. So thanks for joining me on the banks of the River Spey and the Cairngorms, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Cheers.
So that was me talking about Atlantic salmon. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. All the links are in the description to any of the things I mentioned at the start. So if you do want to make a last-minute visit to the live podcast tomorrow, you can do that. If you want to donate to help the podcast run, that would be greatly appreciated. Likewise, leave a review, share it, whatever you can do. And if you think you can make any of the screenings for Britain's Hidden Fishes, I'd love to see some people at those as well. So links will be in the description. A couple of people have mentioned, why haven't I been foreshadowing the next podcast, because normally what I do is I tell people what the podcast is coming up the next week, but I've been editing these in a kind of weird and wonderful way. I can tell you that next week is going to be about Wells catfish, and the guy who I'm interviewing is Philip something or other. I can't remember his surname. But yeah, we're talking about Wells catfish in Portugal and how essentially they are fucking up the ecosystem there, to not put too fine a point on it. So he was a really interesting guy to kind of talk a little bit about that. This has been the Bearded Tits podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Cheers.